So welcome to the continuation of yesterday's lecture on embodied neurodynamics. This is the title page, but I'm actually going to just jump in where I ended yesterday, which was talking about human movement generation, reaching movements really. So moving beyond this vehicle metaphor in which the sensor moves with the body, and I argued that that's going to be different about human movement. And so human movement is quite a complex story. I hinted at that yesterday, and I find that really interesting for this whole theme of embodied cognition, to recognize the complexity. I think one can say that the system, the neural support for reaching for objects, is sort of is like the core of embodied cognition. It is the embodied form, but it entails a lot of cognition. And I would say that some of the structure of that system is seen throughout cognition into higher cognition. It's quite an interesting thing. Maybe as I go through that, you'll get a sense for that. So movement generation, the hand in space toward an object-oriented motion, that entails a lot of things. And this is a survey that comes from a model we published, and that model actually only does a subset of these things. And I'll take you through this model just very roughly, and just giving you a flavor of things. So it goes from perception, visual input, to actual motion, movement generation of your hand in space. Of course, it's in closed loop. This outer arrow indicates that, because you're going to see the consequence of your movement. Like when you move an object, you're going to see that. The visual scene is changing. But there are also a lot of internal feedback loops. These are these other red lines that are projecting back. And of course, you know that each of these boxes contains neural fields that are strongly interactive. And there are actually a couple of other instances where there is closed loops. So it's really very much neurodynamic. And so I would want to take you through this to tell you what the ingredients are. And you will see that pretty much the language elements we've discussed so far in dynamic field theory are sufficient to do all of this. Now, in some cases, I'll just claim that without substantiating it in much detail. We've never really taught at the summer school this more the motor side of things as much. It's actually a good part of my career, and I'm still working very heavily. Half of my group is sort of working on these problems. We have the plan to sometime in the future put more emphasis on these ideas, but I haven't done so. And this year, I'm also going to do it only very briefly. So let's start up there at the perceptual input. So when you direct movement at objects, you of course have to have perception, to see objects, and I'll argue that you have to bring them into the perceptual foreground, and then do something about them. For instance, estimate their pose, and maybe bring the right object into the perceptual foreground, the one that you're looking for, that you're directing your action at. Let's say you want to grasp that blue tube, then you have to find it in the scene and direct your attention at it and estimate where it is to be able to direct your hand, the movement trajectory of your hand at that object. So that is a form of perception that is more challenging than the unsegmented depth profiles that I argued that vehicles can use, for instance, or these views that an animal could use, a rat, for instance, could use to recognize that it is at the same location because it has the same panoramic view as it is looking around. So the first step of that is attentional selection, and we'll have a whole lecture about that tomorrow, I believe, the first case study about the neurodynamic architecture of visual search. And in the lecture that follows this one, I will actually briefly outline the key idea behind that. And the outcome of that is essentially a neurodynamic field that creates activation over space. So these are three activation blobs over space, of which one is selected by cooperative selection that would then indicate the spatial location of the object that you want to attend to. And of course, there could be a lot more to that, like recognition and interesting transforms and so on. So it's just a rough indicator for the sort of stuff that minimally is needed in place. There is a chapter in the book that covers some aspects of this. So that's all I want to say about that. I have in this graph, in this architecture, there are these gray boxes that roughly match these processes to neural substrate. So for instance, visual cortex is involved, of course, in some of this visual processing, especially the feature extraction that is responsible or plays a big role in visual search, and parietal cortex is important in representing the near space in forms that lend themselves to reaching. And there is some interaction between the frontal brain and visual system to steer visual search by goals. I come to sequence generation in a moment. But these indications are very qualitative, and dynamic field theory is not a approach that models neural processes in an anatomically specific way. That is, in many cases you find in the nervous system that multiple structures contribute to the same function, and they would be then one function modeled in a model like this, and we can't really always answer the question of how it's implemented at that next lower level. So this is just sort of rough outline. So if you do have a spatial representation of objects and have maybe selected objects to direct your reaching to, then you then need to prepare your movement. That happens in premotor cortex and motor cortex roughly, with some contributions by the basal ganglia and the cerebellum in the same spirit. And this is something that we already talked about. I want to point out one aspect that I didn't previously mention. We know that reaching movements are directed at the object right from the start. That is, you go off in an approximately straight path. The trajectory is rather straight, and the timing of your hand movement is rather regular. And you can read off the initial path and the initial velocity, which direction the object lies and how far it is and how fast you're going to move. So in that sense, the movement is prepared from the start. It's not like you're moving and then you're sort of updating where you're going, like in visual search. And so that must mean that the initial position of the hand is taken into account in generating the movement. And so what that technically amounts to is a coordinate transform. I'll come back to that in the next lecture, where you represent the object that is maybe represented with respect to your body or your head or your retina. You transform it into a frame that is centered in your hand, and then you can understand how the hand position is taken into account. So we looked at that before because the movement direction of the hand in space is centered in the hand, right? There's a coordinate system that's centered in the hand. And that's what we previously looked at. So the previous work on movement preparation reaction time was a measure on that, and the time movement initiation paradigm sort of looked at the time course of that, of how you prepare a movement. And in fact, we looked at monkey motor cortex, motor and premotor cortex activity reflecting that preparation of a movement. So you know, and it's certainly something that falls within our conceptual framework. So up to this point, we have pretty much fields of the kind that we've discussed. These would be very typical field architectures. And you will see a little bit more of that in the presentation of Jan te Kulve, who will show a subsystem, a sort of a simplified version of that front end for the reaching. Then, of course, you have to understand, if you have prepared a movement, you have to understand how movement is then actually initiated and is also terminated. And in fact, most realistic action is not just one action, it's a sequence of actions where you reach and then grasp and lift and maybe do something else with the object. And that is this issue of how to generate sequences of mental or action states. And I will talk about that today at the last lecture today. There is a lot of work. So it's certainly not true that you initiate a movement just by the activation in motor cortex piercing a threshold. That's a way too simple picture. We need to understand more precisely how that happens, and I will be talking about that a little bit conceptually, but not here in this very detailed concept. And of course, that is what happens when you make a sequence of movements, that you terminate one and then you start the next movement. So I won't go deeper into that. Now, once you have initiated the movement, you need to generate the movement in time. We call that movement timing. And that is something that challenges our concepts a little bit, because this would be an occasion where a time course of activation is generated inside the nervous system, not transduced from somewhere else. I referred to that earlier. And so the common view, I would say, is now somewhat universally accepted in this domain. There's still some debates perhaps about aspects of this. It's really that it's neural oscillators who do that timing. There are different ideas about the nature of these oscillators. So we have modeled these the time generation by the two-layer neural fields that we encountered in the decision-making lecture. This was the video you saw yesterday morning, where or early afternoon, where the time course of decision-making was modeled by excitation inhibition layers. And these systems are capable of oscillation. Actually, I noticed that one of your participants found that oscillatory solution in the two-neuron simulator, because that simulator, actually, the two-neuron model, if coupled correctly, one is excitatory, the other is inhibitory, actually shows these oscillatory patterns, a well-known fact. So that is a possible substrate for this time course generation. We're actually not thinking of these oscillators as really generating periodic patterns, but creating just a single temporally structured response, which is called an active transient. And if you go back to the original Amari paper that we very frequently cite, you will find a mathematical analysis of that active transient in there. And that's an important concept for us, but I decided not to go into the mathematical detail here in these lectures. So it does something like the spike mechanism does, but in a network sense, that if a neuron is triggered, it will make an excursion into excitation and then will be turned off as the inhibitory layer kicks in. And then when inhibition is large enough, activation goes down. And when activation goes down, inhibition goes down and the system is off. And the model that this is quoted from generates time courses through that active transient mechanism and is triggered by a signal from that system that does the movement initiation. It's plotted here as a virtual velocity, and it's thought to be the velocity of the hand in space, the end effector velocity. That's just an interpretation of that signal. What effect it actually has depends on the downstream stuff that I will now be discussing. And there's a lot of complication at that level. But in the end, it turns out that that velocity, that activation signal correlates with the velocity. And actually here at the bottom, you see in a concrete model that has some very simplified actuator and muscle model, which velocity of the hand in space results. And you see there's some relationship, at least the faster movements here that have the larger peak velocity and end earlier, also drive faster hand movement that ends earlier, and so on. And you see also a characteristic delay. You see that the neural timer is in advance over the actual hand movement. And that is actually very true in the nervous system when you do any kind of measurements. In fact, there is direct evidence for something like that. I mean, correlative evidence that comes from Andy Schwartz's lab, who developed the population code idea together with Jacopoulos. And so when you actually measure these kind of population code pictures that activation patterns that I referred to earlier, you can extract a signal that is the total activation in the population. For those who know that it's the length of the population vector, or the sum over the distribution of population activation. And that total activation, this is what I call here the timing signal that is estimated from the population, co-varies with the speed of the hand in space. Co-varies in the sense that you change movement conditions. For instance, even if you make a drawing movement so that the vector changes, so the population moves around in heading direction space, then you find that the amplitude co-varies with the speed, the length of the vector, the tangential velocity. And there's a characteristic time delay between those. It can be less than 200 milliseconds. It can be like 150, 100 milliseconds, depends on the speed of the movement and the movement itself. which is consistent with a lot of other effects we have. There's similar evidence provided by someone called Churchland in Stanford, even though people are a bit critical of his methods, including me. But it's consistent in the sense he extracts from population recordings in motor cortex principal components and then looks at their time courses, and they also show time structure. So that's one set of ideas, and that set of ideas connects to what I hinted at in the introductory lecture about coordination, because coordination is the stabilization of relative timing. If you have multiple limbs and you initiate the movement at the same time, they tends to end at the same time, even if it's inherently asynchronous. For instance, a fast and slow movement combined will tend to end at the same time. Something that you do, human movement is always coordinated that way. When you catch a ball, you will arrive just at the right time. So humans don't go to the location and wait there for the ball to arrive. They arrive just at the right time. So if the ball slows down, they actually also slow down. So they coordinate the timing in detail. And theoretical insight from that work that's a little older. This is a review paper in 2002, but the work is really like 80s and 90s. That work showed that coupling of such underlying neural oscillators can account for a lot of the phenomena in this domain. And this is where I reported in the introduction that this loss of stability occurs. So this is where the idea came from, that behavioral patterns have to have stability properties, and when you lose stability, you switch, and one can understand in detail how neural oscillators go through that instability and they have different coordination patterns and so on. I don't want to go very much into that, but actually what the theoretical work here is consistent with is the idea that timing is generated at the level of low-dimensional variables, like where the hand moves in space, its velocity profile in space, rather than low-level variables like the activation patterns of all the 38 muscles that drive the upper arm. So that's an important point. I'll come back to that. So timing is about hand in space. In fact, as humans, you are particularly skillful in timing your movement in space. For instance, a drummer takes these drumsticks and then is able to control the timing of the tip of the drumstick very well. You're not as good in timing some arbitrary joint configuration in space, for instance, or timing just the activation of your muscles. So it's specific to these spatial representations which come directly off the path. And there you already see perhaps some link to cognition, because we believe that embodied cognition is also emerged from spatial representations and really 2D, 3D space, or low-dimensional space, not some abstract spaces. Good. That's all I want to say about timing. So you can think of this timing as generating some time course of activation that can be activated. The time course of activation can also be updated. You can get feedback into that. For instance, if the object is shifted in the visual array, you can update. But I don't want to go too deep into that. Now, there is a famous problem, sort of a gap between this notion that's studied by cortical neurophysiologists and by kinesiologists and so on, and then the actual machinery of bringing about the movement. The machinery are the muscles and the reflexes that control the muscles. And the gap consists in the fact that you have 760 or approximately muscles in your body. You have, as I mentioned, about 40 for your upper extremity. And you have only this 2- or 3-dimensional vector of your hand in space. And so you have a few to many mapping to solve, and that's called the degree of freedom problem. So it's a question of how the time profiles of activation of all the muscles are derived from this very simple hand velocity in space. And that's not a trivial problem, because if you look at the time course of muscle activation, it's complex. When you move in different directions, different parts of workspace, different effectors, then some muscles will fire early, some will fire late, some will fire once in the movement, others will fire twice, maybe even 3 times in the movement. Their firing patterns will change when you are faced with loads, external loads. In fact, their firing patterns are less invariant than the firing, than the trajectories, the hand trajectories. The famous experiment done by some colleagues in Marseille, where they had participants make a very simple elbow movement, and they put them into this zero gravity flight. So an Airbus that goes up and down in cycles, and participants go from 2G to 0G and so on. A lot of effort. And they were just asking these people to do a periodic movement. And they found that the movement is perfectly continuous through this unloading or loading, while the muscle activation pattern changes, because in 0G, you have to actively pull the arm down, while in 2G, it's just pulled down by gravity. And the muscle that pulls the arm down is actually firing in the opposite phase. Kind of interesting exposure to this invariance principle. So this degree of freedom problem is a famous problem, and the standard thought is that it is one of those feed-forward problems, just like from the retina to your visual representation, you would have a many to few mapping, that here you would have the reverse, a few to many mapping to the periphery. This kind of idea runs under the label of synergies, which means that different muscles tend to co-activate, and so it will be accounted for by having a shared command that activates all these muscles. And I'm involved in work for a long time that shows that it's only half of the story. That is, there is feed-forward, but there's also a lot of important recurrence in this network. There is in particular coupling, compensatory coupling among different motor neurons that makes that you only use a subspace of the potentially high-dimensional space. This runs under the label of uncontrolled manifold, and maybe some of you might have heard about that. I'm not going to review that here. So there are couplings, there are feedback loops, so a little one that we call back coupling and an outer one that we call feedback coupling, and they contribute to these phenomena. So that's a complication that in the vehicle case we didn't have. And so two things that are really different in the vehicle case. One thing is, let's say, is that vehicle movement is not necessarily timed. So for instance, if you're a human locomoting, we described I said that this heading direction dynamics actually describes human locomotion as well. And you're moving to a target, and if somebody blocks your path, an obstacle, you have to avoid it, you lose some time, you will not typically then try to catch up, move faster to arrive at the right time. So we would actually say it's not timed in the sense of it doesn't have stable relative timing. You can actually do that. For instance, if you're catching a ball and running, like I guess in baseball or one of those games, and there you do apply timing to your locomotion. Or if you're walking with someone else and you're trying to catch up, you can coordinate that, but you don't necessarily do that. And that means that that's why we were able to treat the timing variable separately. This was the speed, right? The forward velocity. We just assumed it was constant, or it had some very simple dynamics. And so in all of the hand movement, object-oriented movement, that's not the case. There is timing there, and that timing actually, you will see in a moment, is really important for the control problem. And the second difference is this degree of freedom problem that I just pointed at. Good. And so the lowest level is the actual actuator. The actual actuator is a dynamical system, as I mentioned before. And that's true because it's physically a dynamic system, right? The arm is a rigid body that has its inertia and Coriolis forces and so on. But it's also a dynamical system in the sense of a peripheral reflex loop. I alluded to that earlier, that reflexes, in particular the stretch reflex, are really critical. So the reflex sends back a signal that is monotonic with the length of the muscle through the spindle organ. So the more the muscle is stretched, the longer the muscle is, the more activation is sent back to the motor neuron that drives the muscle. And so what drives the muscle is actually not just the descending activation that comes from the timing level of the motor cortex and so on, but the combination of these two. And that is effectively a dynamical system. So that means that when you're, for instance, making a movement or joint angle in this direction, then the agonist will be shortened in this movement. And as it shortens, it sends less sensory information back. And therefore, this contribution here to the reflex loop is reduced. And what you need is that that there is a increased activation here, so that the sum of those is invariant, so that you get back to the low level of activation that you had initially. Because when you're done with the movement, the muscle goes silent, right? Unless you have a load on your limb. And so that turns out to be true, and I'll show you in a moment that is true without explaining a lot of detail. So the muscles make a temporal excursion that reflects timing, but the descending command is actually it's not monotonic, but ends up at a different level that reflects the new posture. Here is a hint at models like that. For instance, this is a model due to Gribble and Ostry, and there are other models around. It's a model that includes just the physical dynamics of the limb. It includes the transformation of torques to forces, or the other way around. And then actually a model of the biophysics of muscles. This is the fact that muscle force takes some time to build. It's the mechanics of how muscle make forces, and there's some subtleties about that. And this is essentially the reflex model. I'm not explaining that in detail, but the sensed length and the descending activation are combined to drive the muscle. So the muscle activation goes in here through this expression. You don't have to understand that model. I'm just hinting one can model that in some simple form. And actually what we did here in the lab, Gregor did that with Lei Zhang, and Rashid Ramadan contributed to that, is to estimate these descending commands from an actual movement. So we had people do different movements, fast and slow, and then we used this model to estimate what these commands must have been to bring about the movement. You see here the solutions from the model in green and cyan, and the actual movements in red and magenta for back and forth. And you see they're roughly matched onto each other. And the interesting thing from that is that we can thus really see in these movements what the muscle activation is compared to what the descending activation is. So the green is muscle activation for 4 muscles, and I think like 8 movements perhaps. And they vary in workspace. That's what I said earlier. They are less temporally invariant than the hand velocity in space, which would be very uniform. Always a single humped, smooth, what they call a bell-shaped curve. But the muscle activation depends on where you're in workspace, and if you move fast or slow. Dashed is fast and solid is slow. Sorry, this is actually the other way around. Dashed is slow and solid is fast. And what I want to draw your attention to is that the muscle activation always is transient. That is, you start at 0 and at the end you stop firing. It's pretty much true for everyone. Initially 0 and you return to 0, right? Anywhere you go, you see that in the end the muscle is silent again, right? Because this is horizontal movement, so there's no difference in how much gravitation you have to compensate. While the descending command is a shift to a new position. Initially it is here at 0, and then at the end it is at some other level that reflects the new posture. It does have temporal structure, especially if you look at the solid line, the fast movements, then you see there are some wiggles that are complex and that have essentially deal with the forces that you have to overcome, which differ depending on the inertial moment of your arm and the Coriolis and centripetal forces. Those will make demands on the descending command to compensate those. And somehow the nervous system generates those. And that's one of the challenges of in this domain, to understand how that comes about. But they are different from the muscle activation patterns. Not initially. Initially, it's just the muscle that drives. And at the first moment, it's the muscle that drives, the descending command that drives the muscle. That's quite natural in a model like that, that initially that's what you have. And only once the length changes do you actually get a difference here in feedback. But as soon as the movement gets going, you see that these can diverge and move there. So you see that is considerably more complex than this idea of a vehicle receiving a heading direction and then just acting it out, right? We just assumed that the vehicle somehow does that. When you take into account the properties of muscles, then you have a problem there that we hadn't included in the vehicle movement generation situation. And that's what engineers call the control problem. In engineering, it's very typical to separate movement planning from motor control. In the nervous system, it's not clear that these are really so separate. So the timer is sensitive to these control problems must generate the right time course for that. And the time course of the controller, of course, affects what the effective timing will be. Good. So that's all I want to say about reaching movements. You see that it is within the realm of our concepts, but there are open problems there, as I was hinting. And so a lot of work in motor control is about these compensatory forces, and people think about it in what they call computational terms, where they think of what optimization is solved by the nervous system. These are sort of descriptive approaches that maybe add some value, but the physiologically or neurally based theory is still in early days, and we are one of the groups who are actually really trying to contribute to that.